The United States and China have implemented reciprocal tariff measures in 2025, continuing a pattern of trade tensions that began in 2018. The current phase involves tariff adjustments announced by the Trump administration following its return to office in January 2025, with corresponding Chinese countermeasures. These developments occur within a broader context of supply chain restructuring, debate over tariff economic effects, and questions about executive authority in trade policy. The measures affect multiple sectors, including manufacturing, agriculture, technology, and consumer goods. This analysis examines 10 interconnected elements. First, the documented tariff measures and their scope. Second, the economic mechanism by which tariffs affect domestic prices. Third, observed corporate responses through supply chain adjustment. Fourth, the relationship between trade policy and inflation dynamics. Fifth, the legal framework governing executive trade authority. Sixth, corporate pricing strategies in response to tariff costs. Seventh, the political framing of trade restrictions. Eighth, retaliatory measures and their sectoral impact. Ninth, the revenue generation versus consumer cost debate. 10th, long-term structural implications for global trade architecture. The Trump administration announced tariff adjustments on Chinese imports in February 2025. Specific rates vary by product category. The United States Trade Representative Office published the legal framework citing Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which authorizes actions in response to unfair trade practices. Additional tariffs were implemented under Section 232 national security provisions for certain products. China's Ministry of Commerce announced retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, energy exports, and manufactured goods. The rates range from 10 to 25% depending on product category. Chinese authorities cited World Trade Organization dispute resolution mechanisms and characterized the measures as defensive responses to U.S. actions. The cumulative effect adds to existing tariff structures implemented during 2018-2020 and partially maintained during the Biden administration. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, effective tariff rates on Chinese goods increased from approximately 3% in 2017 to levels exceeding 19% by 2025 when all measures are calculated. Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods increased from approximately 8% to over 21% during the same period. The documented scope affects hundreds of billions of dollars in bilateral trade. U.S. imports from China exceeded $400 billion in 2024. U.S. exports to China totaled approximately $150 billion. The tariff measures apply to substantial portions of these trade flows, though some categories remain exempt or subject to exclusion processes. Economic theory regarding tariff incidence has been extensively studied. The standard analysis holds that tariffs function as taxes on imported goods. Who bears the cost depends on price elasticity of supply and demand. When foreign suppliers have limited ability to reduce prices and domestic purchasers have limited alternatives, the cost falls primarily on domestic purchasers. Empirical studies of the 2018-2020 tariff implementation provide documented evidence. Research by economists at the Federal Reserve, University of Chicago, Princeton, and other institutions examined price changes following tariff implementation. The findings published in peer-reviewed journals show that tariff costs were almost entirely passed through to U.S. importers and consumers, rather than being absorbed by Chinese exporters through price reductions. The mechanism works as follows. When a tariff is imposed, the importing company must pay the tariff to U.S. Customs at the border. This increases the company's cost of acquiring the product. To maintain profit margins, companies typically increase prices charged to the next level in the supply chain. This process continues through wholesalers, distributors, and retailers until it reaches consumer prices. Some products have longer supply chains with multiple price adjustments. Others have shorter chains where importers sell directly to retailers or consumers. The degree of price increase at each stage depends on competitive conditions, contract structures, and market power. However, the cumulative effect across the supply chain typically results in higher final consumer prices. Alternative views exist. Some analysts argue that foreign exporters absorb costs through currency adjustments or efficiency improvements. Others suggest that domestic production substitution prevents price increases. However, the empirical literature examining actual price data from 2018-2020 finds limited evidence supporting these alternatives for most product categories. Companies subject to tariff costs face several strategic options. First, they can absorb the cost and accept reduced profit margins. Second, they can pass cost to customers through price increases. Third, they can restructure supply chains to source from countries not subject to tariffs. Fourth, they can apply for tariff exclusions through administrative processes. Documented corporate responses show all four strategies being employed to varying degrees. Supply chain restructuring has been particularly significant. Trade data shows shifts in import sources. U.S. imports from Vietnam, Mexico, India, and other countries increased substantially between 2018 and 2024. Some of this represents genuine production relocation. Some represents transshipment, where Chinese products are routed through third countries with minimal processing. Supply chain restructuring requires significant time and capital investment. Manufacturing facilities must be built or expanded in alternative locations. Supplier relationships must be established. Quality control systems must be implemented. Logistics networks must be reconfigured. Industry analysts estimate that comprehensive supply chain restructuring for complex products requires 3 to 5 years and involves costs that can exceed 10 to 15% of annual procurement spending. The pace of restructuring varies by industry. Labor-intensive manufacturing in categories like textiles and basic electronics has moved more quickly. Capital-intensive manufacturing with specialized equipment requirements moves more slowly. High-technology products with complex supply chains and intellectual property considerations present particular challenges. Southeast Asian countries, Mexico, and India have received substantial manufacturing investment. Vietnam's exports to the United States increased from approximately $50 billion in 2017 to over $110 billion by 2024. Mexico's manufacturing exports increased from approximately $320 billion to over $470 billion during the same period. These shifts reflect both tariff-motivated restructuring and other factors, including regional trade agreements and labor cost considerations. The relationship between trade policy and inflation is structurally complex. Tariffs increase prices for affected imported goods. If these goods represent a significant portion of consumer spending, the effect appears in consumer price indices. The magnitude depends on the share of tariffed goods in total consumption and the degree of price pass-through. Economic analysis by the Federal Reserve and other institutions estimates that tariff measures implemented in 2018-2020 contributed approximately 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points to consumer price inflation. This represents a modest but measurable effect, given that total inflation during that period varied between 1.5 and 2.5% annually. The current phase of tariff implementation occurs in a different macroeconomic context. Inflation rates in 2024 averaged approximately 3% following the spike to over 8% in 2022. The Federal Reserve has maintained interest rates at elevated levels to control inflation. Additional price pressures from tariffs complicate monetary policy decisions regarding when to reduce rates. Consumer surveys document concern about cost of living pressures. Lower and middle-income households allocate larger portions of income to goods affected by tariffs, including clothing, electronics, and household items. Higher-income households allocate relatively more to services which are less affected by import tariffs. This creates distributional effects where tariff costs fall disproportionately on households with lower incomes. Critics of current tariff policy emphasize this distributional impact and argue that tariffs function as a regressive tax. Defenders argue that protecting domestic manufacturing preserves employment opportunities for workers in affected sectors and that this employment benefit outweighs consumer price effects. This represents a fundamental policy trade-off between consumer and producer interests. Executive authority in trade policy derives from multiple legal sources. The Constitution grants Congress authority to regulate foreign commerce. However, Congress has delegated substantial authority to the President through various statutes. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows presidential action against unfair trade practices. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 allows tariffs for national security reasons. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act provides broad authority during declared emergencies. The scope and limits of these authorities remain subject to legal debate. Court challenges have questioned whether certain tariff implementations exceed statutory authority or violate due process requirements. The U.S. Court of International Trade has reviewed multiple tariff actions with varying outcomes. Some challenges were dismissed. Others resulted in remand for additional administrative procedures. Congressional oversight of executive trade actions occurs through committee hearings and legislative proposals. Some members of Congress have proposed legislation to constrain executive tariff authority or require congressional approval for certain actions. These proposals have not achieved enactment, reflecting disagreement over the appropriate balance between executive flexibility and legislative control. International law through the World Trade Organization establishes rules for trade restrictions. WTO dispute resolution panels have reviewed some U.S. and Chinese tariff measures. Panel rulings have found certain measures inconsistent with WTO obligations. However, enforcement of WTO rulings depends on voluntary compliance, as the organization lacks coercive enforcement mechanisms. Corporate pricing strategies in response to tariff costs vary by competitive dynamics. In highly competitive markets with multiple suppliers, companies have limited ability to raise prices without losing market share. The tariff cost may be partially absorbed. In markets with limited competition or differentiated products, companies have greater pricing power and can more readily pass costs to customers. Some companies have increased prices beyond direct tariff costs. Business analysts describe this as using tariffs as cover for margin enhancement. When customers expect price increases due to tariffs, companies may increase prices by amounts exceeding actual tariff costs. Distinguishing between tariff-justified price increases and opportunistic pricing requires detailed cost accounting that is typically not publicly available. Retailer data shows price increases for imported goods during 2018-2020 that correlated with tariff implementation. Academic studies controlling for other factors found that price increases closely match tariff rates for most product categories, suggesting competitive forces limited excessive price escalation. However, variation exists across sectors and companies. Political discourse around trade policy emphasizes protection of domestic industry and workers. Proponents of tariffs argue they level the playing field against countries with lower labor costs, weaker environmental regulations, or government subsidies. The framing emphasizes national economic security and industrial capacity preservation. This narrative appears in official statements, political campaigns, and policy documents. The Trump administration has characterized trade policy as reclaiming economic sovereignty and reversing decades of unfavorable trade deals. The framing resonates with constituencies affected by manufacturing job losses and communities experiencing economic dislocation. Alternative framing emphasizes benefits of open trade, including consumer access to diverse products, competitive prices, and economic efficiency through comparative advantage. This perspective appears in statements from economists, business associations representing importers and retailers, and consumer advocacy organizations. Public opinion polling shows divided views. Surveys indicate that approximately 40 to 50% of Americans support using tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing, while similar percentages express concern about consumer price effects. Views correlate with educational attainment, employment sector, and political affiliation. Chinese retaliatory tariffs have targeted U.S. sectors with political significance. Agricultural products, including soybeans, pork, and other commodities, face elevated Chinese tariffs. U.S. agricultural exports to China declined substantially following tariff implementation. Soybean exports dropped from approximately $12 billion in 2017 to under $8 billion during peak trade tensions before partially recovering. The sectoral impact varies by product and market alternatives. U.S. soybean farmers lost market share to Brazilian producers who increased exports to China. U.S. pork producers faced reduced access requiring alternative export markets. Some agricultural commodities have limited alternative buyers, making producers particularly vulnerable to Chinese market access restrictions. Manufacturing exports also face retaliatory tariffs. Aircraft, machinery, and chemicals are among affected categories. Companies in these sectors have reported order cancellations or reduced competitiveness in Chinese markets. The long-term effect includes potential permanent market share loss to European or Asian competitors. The U.S. government provided direct payments to agricultural producers totaling over $20 billion between 2018 and 2020 to offset losses from Chinese tariffs. These market facilitation program payments compensated farmers for price declines attributed to trade disruption. The payments represent fiscal costs of trade policy beyond the tariff measures themselves. The debate over tariff economic effects includes questions about revenue generation. Tariff collections are recorded as government revenue. U.S. tariff collections increased from approximately $35 billion in 2017 to over $80 billion by 2024. This represents additional federal revenue that could offset other taxes or fund government spending. However, economic analysis emphasizes that the source of this revenue is domestic purchasers paying higher prices. The revenue is not extracted from foreign countries, but from domestic economic activity. The net fiscal effect depends on broader economic impacts, including any reduction in income tax revenue if economic growth slows due to trade restrictions. Compared to the overall federal budget exceeding $6 trillion, tariff revenue represents approximately 1 to 2% of total receipts. Income taxes, payroll taxes, and corporate taxes constitute the majority of federal revenue. Tariffs generate modest revenue relative to total government financing needs. Some analysts argue that tariff revenue should be evaluated as part of broader strategic objectives, including industrial policy and national security, rather than purely fiscal terms. Others emphasize that equivalent revenue could be raised through alternative tax mechanisms that create less economic distortion and more progressive distributional effects. Long-term implications of sustained trade restrictions depend on multiple factors. If tariffs remain elevated indefinitely, the supply chain restructuring becomes permanent. Manufacturing capacity continues shifting to alternative countries. U.S. China economic integration decreases. The global economy operates with higher transaction costs and reduced efficiency. Academic research on historical trade restrictions provides context. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 raised U.S. tariffs substantially. Trading partners retaliated. Global trade volumes declined. Economists debate the magnitude of the act's contribution to the Great Depression, but consensus exists that it worsened economic conditions. Contemporary analysis suggests current trade restrictions are unlikely to replicate 1930s outcomes due to different scale and economic context. However, sustained restrictions could reduce global economic growth by fractions of a percentage point annually. Compound effects over decades could result in measurably lower living standards relative to alternative policy paths. Technology sector implications deserve particular attention. U.S. China tensions extend beyond tariffs to export controls on semiconductors, restrictions on technology investment, and concerns about supply chain vulnerabilities. These measures affect cutting-edge technologies, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing. The technology decoupling creates parallel supply chains and innovation ecosystems. This may accelerate technological development through competition. It may also reduce efficiency through duplication and create security vulnerabilities through reduced cooperation on global challenges. To summarize the core analytical findings, the United States and China have implemented reciprocal tariffs affecting hundreds of billions in trade. Economic evidence shows tariff costs are primarily borne by domestic purchasers through higher prices. Companies are restructuring supply chains to alternative countries at substantial time and capital cost. Tariffs contribute measurably to inflation with disproportionate impact on lower-income households. Executive trade authority derives from delegated congressional power with ongoing debate over appropriate limits. Corporate pricing strategies vary by competitive dynamics, with some evidence of margin enhancement beyond direct tariff costs. Political framing emphasizes economic nationalism and industrial protection. Chinese retaliatory measures particularly affect agriculture and selected manufacturing sectors. Tariffs generate government revenue, but this comes from domestic economic activity rather than foreign sources. Long-term implications include permanent supply chain restructuring, reduced economic efficiency, and potential fragmentation of global technology ecosystems. What remains uncertain is whether current measures represent negotiating tactics that will lead to agreement, reducing restrictions, or whether they mark permanent structural shift toward economic separation. The trajectory of supply chain restructuring, the effectiveness of alternative sourcing in avoiding tariff exposure, the political sustainability of trade restrictions given consumer price effects, and the broader geopolitical implications of economic decoupling remain subject to ongoing developments. The key variables shaping future outcomes include political will to maintain restrictions despite economic costs, China's strategic responses, third country positioning in evolving trade networks, technological developments enabling production restructuring, and multilateral trade governance through international institutions. Analysis continues tracking trade flow data, price indices, corporate investment decisions, and policy announcements from relevant governments.